evening. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar, which is part of the Pluralist Economics Workshop, jointly organized from Nile University of Nigeria, Exploring Economics in Germany, and funded by Heinrich Böll Foundation. This is the first lecture as part of the workshop, and we're glad to welcome Professor Ganiyu Garba, who will talk on a discipline in need of a new foundation, a critical assessment of the philosophy and methodology of economics. Professor Ganiyu was a professor of mine at Ahmadu Bello University. He's someone who inspires students, generations of students, and I'm really glad that he's able to join us, even though he has retired from academia and is working now on think tank and economic policy. Let me briefly introduce him, and I will then allow him to talk. He will talk for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we can open the floor for conversation. So you can ask questions or make comments, which he will respond to. Yeah, Professor Ganiyu Garba was a professor of economics at Ahmadu Bello University until 2017, I think, 16. He studied economics there, graduating with bachelor's degree, first class, and also master's in economics. Then he went to University of Ibadan, where he finished his PhD in economics. And since then, he's been teaching at Ahmadu Bello University until his retirement. He has published a lot in different fields of economics, development economics, political economy, monetary economics, international economics, and several fields. He's also served in different capacities as the director of the Gender Institutes of Codestria in Senegal, and he also served as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and was also a visiting scholar at IMF in Washington. He's married to Professor Precious Kasi Garba, who is also a professor of economics and a very nice person. Professor Ganiyu Garba gave his inaugural lecture, which was titled Economics, a Discipline in Need of a New Foundation. I don't know if you can see from here, in 2014. And this is a lecture which I'll keep with me, I think, forever. So I really hope you will enjoy this session, and thank you so much for joining, everyone. And yeah, join me in welcoming Professor Ganiyu Garba.
Thank you very much, Abdulrasheed. Please, I would like to share my screen.
Yes, please, Prof. You can start. Please, if you are having any issue listening to us or seeing our video, please feel free to talk to us.
All right. So the topic that I've chosen for the lecture is Shifting Foundations of Economics. And I'm focusing on the role of theology in addition to philosophy and methodology. As Abdulrasheed said, I presented my inaugural in 2014. And the title of the inaugural was Economics, a Discipline in Need of a New Foundation. So I'm going to start from that, the inaugural.
Excuse me, Prof. I'm not sure if you've started sharing the screen.
Okay, let me see. Is it visible now?
Yeah, it's coming up now.
Okay, all right. So as I was saying,
it's still blank, so I don't know if participant can see. Please, can you raise your hand if you can see his screen? It's just dark here.
Okay. Is anybody able to see
Please, you can write in the chat or in the Q&A. No, it is
Okay, it's not visible still.
loading. It's showing. Just wait, please. We will resolve that as soon as possible.
Okay.
Oh, Prof, if you can just email it to me and I'll share it.
Okay, it's all right. I'll send it to your WhatsApp.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, but I think you can just start talking and we can share the screen later. Maybe it's network issue. Sorry about that, please. We will resolve that as soon as possible.
Sorry.
Oh, okay, it's showing now, Prof. I think you can go on.
All right, okay.
Yeah, it's showing.
Okay. So in 2014, as Abdulrasheed said, I presented the inaugural at Ahmadu Bello University titled Economics, a Discipline in Need of a New Foundation. But for today's discussion, I'm titling the presentation Shifting Foundations of Economics. Is it still visible?
Yes, it's it.
So I'm titling Shifting Foundations of Economics, the Role of Theology, Philosophy, and Methodology. And I've structured the discussion around the background, a background, and then the definition of key concepts, and then the discussion of the shifting foundations of economics, and then I end with some reflections. Now, in terms of the background is actually from the inaugural itself. I want to highlight some of the arguments, the central arguments in the inaugural in 2014. First of all, I want to specify the issue of social responsibility of economics. And this is drawing from Keynes, his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. The chapter 24, which I considered to be the most powerful chapter in the book, emphasize the significance of economic ideas and the power of economic ideas and the influence when they are right and when they are wrong. And I thought in the inaugural, I made it clear that economists have a huge responsibility to make sure that economic ideas that they teach, economic ideas that they learn, and economic ideas that undergird economic policies are actually solid and sound. Because if they are not sound, the consequences are serious. And therefore, every economist should understand that he or she carries a social or moral burden to ensure that the economics that you do is actually the right economics, the economics that will not create problems, but the economics that will solve problems. And also in the inaugural, I emphasize that the foundation of economics is actually a foundation of vices. And I'll just quickly move to a chart that sort of shows the foundation I'm talking about. If you look at the chart, at the foundation are the values, typical values in economics, the values of the Homo economicus being self-centered, materialistic, hedonistic, pleasure-seeking, and of course the overall principle of laissez-faire, which is permissive. And then the worldview of a temporal worldview and the worldview where resources are very scarce. So it is on this foundation that the whole idea of scarcity is built, and the idea of scarcity then leads to the idea of choice, and then the key institutions that economists commit to in terms of metaphysical commitment is perfect competition and Homo economicus. So on this conceptual system is then built equilibrium theory. And the first equilibrium theory that we deal with in economics is goal equilibrium, the equilibrium of the consumer and the equilibrium of the producer. And then from the equilibrium of the consumer and the producer, we get our demand and supply functions, which then provide the foundations for competitive equilibrium analysis, either of a partial nature or of a general nature. And then after that, we then consider the issues of welfare. So we then have positive theorizing, and then we have normative theorizing built on the positive theorizing. So this is in a nutshell the core of economics. The extension to macroeconomics, the extension to applied economics are built on the foundation, on the conceptual system, and on the equilibrium theorizing that takes place in economics. So I was emphasizing that with the foundation being vices rather than virtues, it is not accidental that we then find that inequalities, extreme inequalities, are essential features of economics. It is also not accidental that we have instability as an underlying feature of economics. So I was emphasizing that we needed a new foundation, and that the new foundation does require a new purpose for economics. It does require a new epistemological commitment for economics. It does require new metaphysical commitments for economics. It requires new ethical commitments for economics, and it requires new exemplars and new structures for economics. So that was where I ended in 2014. Now, after 2014, I had to think through the issue of new foundations again. And it occurred to me that merely changing the foundation of economics would not necessarily retain economics the way it is, because I was conscious of the fact that it is not possible to change the root of a tree without killing the tree, which means that if you change the foundations of economics, you're actually going to change the building of economics. And that led me to the issue of theonomics. And I've also learned from history, and I'm going to share some of the lessons I've learned from history of economic thought. Because usually, conventionally, economists will not believe that theology is at the foundations of economics, because it is usually ascribed to people who go to seminaries. But I found that philosophy, theology, and methodology are actually very deep in the history of economic thought. That as we study the history of economic thought more deeply, particularly giving attention to the original works, not just what has been passed down and summarized in textbooks of history of economic thought, but reading the classic works of history of economic thought, it is easy to bring forth the underlying theology, the underlying philosophy, and the underlying methodology of economics. So I thought, and I've tried to encourage students to take the history of economic thought more seriously. So just to sum my views in the inaugural, I suggested then that we needed 6 pillars for a new foundation in economics. The first pillar is purpose. The old pillar, the revealed purpose of economics, is that the whole idea that rational greed with laissez-faire will help to produce individual and social optimum within nations across nations. So as long as we allow rational greed to prevail, as long as we allow laissez-faire to prevail, individuals will be at optimum, society will be at optimum, and the world will also be at optimum. But there's a hidden purpose, and the hidden purpose is that that kind of economics serves the interests of the most powerful economic classes in society. And that is why we see a consistent feature or characteristics or attribute of economics over time is the extreme inequalities and also the unfairness of the economic system. And we then thought that we then need to change that purpose so that economics will have a new purpose of empowering human beings to make morally sound and wise decisions. And that economics should not be interested in promoting rational greed and advocating for laissez-faire, but economics should be devoted to solving problems. We have development problems, we have problems of unfairness, we have problems of unemployment, of poverty, of inequality, of insecurity, of instability, and of course, business cycles. Let economics be focused on solving those problems rather than serving the interests of the most powerful economic classes. So we thought that with that, you can then begin to talk in terms of a new foundation. Then in terms of epistemological commitment of economics, economics is committed to the ontology of positivism, and that focuses on explanation and prediction. And it also excludes revelation and illumination. And we thought that that was too narrow and that we needed an epistemological commitment that allows not only the mind and senses, but also admits of revelation and illumination and intuition as sources of knowledge, rather than purely mind and senses as the only sources of knowledge. And of course, we know that the human mind can be corrupted, the human senses can be corrupted, and the human mind is limited, the human senses are limited. So we depend on corrupt faculties that are likely to be corrupted and are limited. It means that our understanding, the kind of knowledge we can produce from economics will also be limited and, of course, face the danger of being corrupted. Then in terms of metaphysical commitment, economics insists on the homo economicus, again arising from the works of mercantilists, who believe that human beings are egoistic and incapable of change. And over time, economists have adopted that human caricature. And therefore, they also invented the issue of perfect markets. We know that perfect markets don't exist. We know that homo economicus don't exist, because if we subject it to question of whether they exist or not, we know that the issue of perfection will rule out the possibility of homo economicus existing. And then, of course, there's a metaphysical commitment to greed and non-contentment. And we need non-contentment in consumer theory, because without non-contentment, you cannot prove the existence of real valued ordinary utility function. But non-contentment is a cost. And so the essential nature of humanity that's in economics is a very dismal stereotype. And I thought that we needed to change that to recognizing that humanity is interconnected. And therefore, what happens to A affects B, and what happens to B affects A. So A should have not only his own interest, but the interest of A as well as the interest of B. And B should also have not only the interest of B, but the interest of B as well as the interest of A. And also the issue of greed. The essential nature, greed is not part of the essential nature of humanity. It is not what makes us human. And also, because of the nature of evolution of economic thought and economic power relations, we then emphasize accidental natures of skin color, of class, of race, of greed, of ethnicity, and use that to structure human beings into different compartments. And that undermines the ability of humanity to come together in a cooperative platform to accomplish far more than we're able to accomplish using the so-called competitive struggle, either for markets or for winning or for superiority of one nation or the other. Then in terms of ethical commitment, the utilitarian idea that pleasure and pain are sovereign masters is a theology. And I thought that is the wrong theology. Unfortunately, because it is not well taught in economics, and students don't go back to read Jeremy Bentham, and they don't go back to read William Stanley Jevons, they don't understand how that theology has influenced economics to become slaves of pain and slaves of pleasure. And of course, we know that that is a theology that is not necessarily the correct theology for economics. And overemphasizes on efficiency and also restricted boundaries that exclude conscience and morality and religious motives. Because Jeremy Bentham was very clear that he wanted to create an ethical system that makes it to overshadow conscience, to overshadow religious motives, to overshadow every other consideration. And we thought that that philosophy then brings man under the control of pleasure and pain. And that we believe that it makes human beings to make morally unsound decisions. And that in terms of shifting to a new foundation, we need to empower human beings to make morally sound and wise choices, and to have knowledge, to have insight, and also to emphasize character. Because it is assumed that equity is not integral to economics, but equity is at the foundations of economics. And so the idea that it is not is simply a smokescreen, because the reality is that equity is at the foundation of economics. Indeed, without equity, you can't talk about demand function. Without equity, you can't talk about supply function. Because the idea that the consumer seeks to maximize utility allows you to be able to determine the optimization point, and therefore individual demand and individual market demand. The idea that producers maximize profit allows you to be able to identify point of equilibrium for supply for producers, and therefore individual supply and then market supply. Then you can have the supply and demand together in the market system. So without that cost of non-contentment, it is not possible to have it. But to inject a cost into understanding of a human phenomena brings cost into the consequences of that kind of phenomena. And we thought that that should change. And in terms of exemplars, Mills emphasized that economics should mimic physics, focus on the movement of planets. As far as Lord Robbins was concerned, economics should also mimic physics by looking at mechanics. And because of the influence of Lord Robbins on contemporary economics, we then find that it is mechanics that is at the center of economics. Because the whole idea of equilibrium, the whole idea of comparative statics is from mechanics. And we thought that in terms of evolutionary process, maybe biology will offer a better foundation than physics. Of course, others have also emphasized that biology is an alternative. And then in terms of structure, which is the sixth pillar, the theories of rational grief are constructed on morally deficient foundations. And we thought that building on a structurally deficient foundation undermines economics, undermines the choices that people arrive at using economic principles, and undermines the outcomes, the social outcomes from the use of economic theory. And that is why we suggested that the structure of the economy should be built on virtuous foundations. And then the principles of trade-off and opportunity cost and incentive, both intrinsic and intrinsic, should also feature in that new foundation. And so this is what we propose at the end of the inaugural. We propose a foundation that has a clear purpose and a clear ethical commitment. We also propose a metaphysical and epistemological commitment that is completely different from that of the conventional economics. And we then thought that the structure can have three layers. One, at the bottom, the foundation. Then second, the layer of understanding that the environment is constantly changing. For instance, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and the pandemic is already changing the way we understand economics. And the essential nature, influence of the pandemic are things that we need to understand and to inject into economic analysis. So the dynamic space for economic thought is, the space for economic thought is not static, it's dynamic. And we must recognize that dynamism. And so economic phenomena is changing, the environment is changing, economic phenomena is changing. The interplay between the changing environment and the changing economic phenomena should be understood to produce economic theories and economic advice that are purpose-driven, that can actually achieve the problems that we are currently facing with COVID and problems that we are likely to face in the future. So it means that every generation of economics must not depend on previous generation of economics to think that the work of thought has ended with previous generation, or that they can confidently rely on the works of succeeding previous generation, because every generation confronts different changing environments, different changing economic phenomena, and they should get to grips with understanding how the environment is changing, and get to grips with understanding how economic phenomena ought to change as the environment is changing. And then everything should be guided by purpose. The economic theories will not be for the purpose of just publications and becoming a professor, and that's the end of it. The social responsibilities require that the theories that economists construct are theories that solve concrete problems in society, so that we can move away from the iniquities of society to a better society. Because we tend to see ourselves as humans as civilized on the basis of technology. But civilization is on the basis of interpersonal relationships. The relationship between humans, how we treat each other in our interconnectedness, is a true measure of how civilized we are. Because if we can condone an economic system that produces few rich people and a large crowd of poor people, that cannot be civilization. As a matter of fact, that is regression. And therefore, any economic advice that promotes that iniquity, rather than closing the gap of iniquity and improving moving away from iniquity to a more equal, from an unfair system to a more fair system, that cannot be said to be advances in civilization. So that is where we ended with the inaugural. Now, the lessons we've learned from the history of economic thought is that economics is actually a system of meaning, a system of thought, and a system of practice. And that economics has two foundations: theology and Western philosophy. And out of Western philosophy, three things are important. The first is metaphysics, because the ontology of economics, both deductive method and inductive method, comes from metaphysics. Then epistemology of economics also comes from metaphysics. The overall emphasis on know-how, on know that rather, propositional knowledge, comes from metaphysics, from epistemology. And the ethics of pleasure, the ethics of pain, the ethics of scarcity, the ethics of self, of greed, of hedonism, comes from utilitarianism. And then the theology and philosophy of economics, we are convinced, are hidden in the history of economic thought. And as we studied the history of economic thought, we came across two important questions in Marshall's Principles of Economics, which he published in 1890. Unfortunately, Marshall raised those questions, but he did not place them at the center of principles. And he also provided a problematic that is also very powerful for a new foundation in economics, but he didn't pursue it. Obviously because the underlying interest, the dominant interest, did not permit the answers or to focus on those questions and also the problematic. And I want to share with you quickly those questions, which are called Marshallian questions. The first Marshallian question is the necessity question. And he says whether they need the large numbers of people doomed from their birth to hard work in order to provide for others the requisites of a refined and cultured life, while they themselves are prevented by their poverty and toil from having any share or part in that life. And the necessity question is simply suggesting, is the extreme inequality in the world really necessary? That's what the substance of that question. Then he also asks a second question, which I call the possibility question. And he asks, is it really impossible that all human beings should start in the world with a fair chance of leading a cultured life, free from the pains of poverty and the stagnating influences of excessive mechanical toil? And this question is being pressed to the front by the growing earnestness of the age. That was in 1890. And the possibility question is simply saying, is there a possibility of fairness in the global economic system so that everybody starts with a fair chance of living a life of happiness, if that's what they would desire to do? Unfortunately, Marshall didn't pursue that. He still retreated to the normal economics that we have today. Now, I also want to share with you the Marshallian problematic, because he struggled with the concept of competition, which was advocated by the classicals, led by Adam Smith. And he suggested that if competition is contrasted with energetic cooperation in unselfish work for the public good, then even the best form of competition are relatively evil, while its harsher and meaner forms are hateful. So you would rather have had a competitive economic built on cooperation rather than competition. But building on the theology of the mercantilists about humanity, about being egoistic and incapable of change, he is then suggested that even though that is the best that is required, however, the reality is that human beings do not have those abilities of being unselfish and being cooperative. So we do know that there are recent studies in psychology and in other related disciplines that suggest that our typical incentive system do not work in the real world. It works only for people who are performing ordinary tasks. But for conceptual work, you don't pay people to become more interested in doing what they are doing. The intrinsic value of what they are doing motivates them to do what they are doing. And so the idea that the incentive has to be financial and the relationship has to be transactional, which is the whole essence of competition, Marshall cast some doubt on it. But again, he didn't proceed with that doubt to then build his principles on these foundations that he had laid. He said, following this foundation that he had laid, that the supreme aim of the economist is to discover how these latent social assets can be developed most quickly and turned to account most wisely. So in other words, he needed to have built an economic system on the latent social assets of cooperation for the public good. Unfortunately, because of the times and probably the kind of appointment that he had to still continue the neoclassical work, which is best known for today. Now, so that said, some of the issues that came out from the history of economic thought. So as I've said, the theology, philosophy, and methodology are deeply rooted in economics, but we can have clarity about them, not in our microeconomics, not in our macroeconomics, and in other subjects that constitute the dominant curriculum of economics today. We have to go back to the history of economics first, and not in the summaries of history of economics first, but reading the classical works and understanding them. Then we can figure out very clearly what theology is in economics, what philosophy is in economics, what methodology is in economics. And just for simplicity, theology is the study of God. And the key theological terms are God, universe, Jesus Christ, Holy Spirit, redemption, man, future. This Christian theology. So the study of God in terms of theological themes, in terms of theological doctrines, in terms of theological statements, this constitutes theology. And whether you are an atheist or not, as long as you talk about universe, you are implicitly talking about God, and you are implicitly talking about man. You are implicitly talking about the future. Whatever statement you make about the universe, whatever statement you make about man, whatever statements you make about the future, you are doing theology. So that is as far as theology is. So we may think we are not doing theology, but we're actually doing theology. When we say homo economicus, that's theology. Perfect market, that's theology. And as for philosophy, the philosophers love to think of themselves as lovers of wisdom. But the reality of philosophy is that it is sustained intellectual inquiry in any area, either in the area of metaphysics, in the area of epistemology, in the area of ethics, in the area of religion, aesthetics, linguistics. All those are areas of sustained intellectual inquiry that constitute philosophy. Philosophy is conceptual, and it employs rhetoric. Rhetoric is argument, and that is why the presentation of claims of philosophers, of scientists, and even of economics are in the form of arguments, because arguments are the language instruments that we use to make our claims, so that people will see the premise of the argument, people will see the logic of the reasoning, and people will see the conclusion, and they can evaluate the argument to see whether the argument is valid, or the argument is superfluous, the argument is invalid, or the argument is ambiguous. They can form their judgment. But that is why philosophy tends to be argumentative. And that is why there are many schools of philosophy that on virtually every issue, it is difficult to come to a consensus. Even in the area of epistemology, you have the continuing debate between the nominalists and the realists or the idealists, and then the conceptualism in epistemological schools. And then as far as methodology, I emphasize the distinction between method, which is techniques and procedures, and methodology. There's a distinction between methodology and method. Method is technique, they are procedures, which is why we have statistical methods, we have econometric methods, we have other methods of economics such as deductive methods, the inductive methods, the experimental methods. These are just procedures and technique. But methodology itself applies to the discipline as a whole. It looks at the methods of the discipline and tries to justify why the discipline has such methods. And just before I look at the shifting platform, let me go to the methodological investigation economics and the kind of question it asks. The question it asks are, what are the goals of economics? That's the methodological question. If we are clear about the goals of economics, then we can see whether the methods of economics can actually accomplish the goals of economics. So that we can then begin to justify the goals, the methods of economics on the basis of the goals that economists set for themselves to accomplish. And then the second question is, how do economists theorize? Because there's a right theorizing, there's a wrong theorizing. As a matter of fact, the first chapter of the general theory of Keynes was suggesting that the theorizing approach of the classicals was built on the wrong foundation. And because it was built on the wrong foundation, its conclusions are wrong. And the applications of those wrong conclusions to real problems is disastrous. That's what Keynes argued in the very first chapter of the general theory. And then some will also debate, is economics really a science? Because the real problem means that you cannot have the kind of causality that you have in natural sciences. Because once you have a will, it then means that the cause-effect analysis of the natural sciences may not apply to economics. So there are questions as to whether is economics really a science? And that debate has gone on. And of course, they are in the history of economic thought. Then in terms of methodological investigation economics, you appraise economic theorizing and economic theory. And you distinguish good theorizing and good theories from bad theorizing and bad theories. And then you can investigate the structure of microeconomics and the structure of general equilibrium theory and the strategies and heuristics that guide contemporary economic theorizing. And then, of course, the goal of economic theorizing and relations between economic theory and economic policy are also issues of methodological investigation. Now, the next thing that I will spend time to go through is the shifting foundations of economics. Now, when we do history of economic thought, we normally will start from the ancient Greeks to the contemporary. And in terms of the major schools, we have the ancient schools of the Greek schools, then we have the Scholastics, then we have the classicals, the mercantilists, and the physiocrats. Then we have the classicals, then the neoclassicals, then the Keynesian revolution, and then everything that happened after that will be part of the whole history of economic thought. Now we go back to ancient history, and then we want to ask, what was the underlying theology? What was the underlying philosophy? What was the underlying methodology? And from what you are saying, the underlying theology was non-Christian. Protagoras was an atheist. That is why he believed as a sophist that man is a measure of everything and that there's no objectivity. So when people say they are postmodernists and they are everything socially constructed, the original social constructor, the postmodernist, of course, is not the postmodernist, but the original idea of the postmodernist is coming from Protagoras, who was an atheist. So it's an atheist theology. Then we have polytheists. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon. They were all polytheists. If you read Plato's Republic, the very first paragraph will tell you that Socrates and Glaucon, when they started the argument, they were actually going to worship, to see the worship of a new goddess. And so clearly, even within Plato and their writings, you see that they were polytheists. And so their theology is very clear. And then in terms of philosophy, sophism, man is the measure of everything. And then Socrates, we know his ethics and also his epistemology. His epistemology is that knowledge is innate and is discoverable. Plato agrees that knowledge is innate, but only philosophers can discover it. And Aristotle disagrees that knowledge is innate. He believes that we can discover knowledge from observing and forming generalization from observation. And which is why, in terms of their methodologies, you have the sophists pushing the methodology of rhetoric, which is argument, oratorial skills, the ability to win argument without interest in the ethics of the argument. That's not the issue. It's not whether it is right or wrong, but can we win the argument? That's the focus of the sophists. Then Socratic dialogue, we see in Plato's work, we see it in Xenophon, the form of dialogue. And then Aristotelian logic and empiricism also comes out of Aristotle's work. But the two dominant ideas of the time were idealism, which today is rationalism, and nominalism, which today is empiricism. So empiricism and rationalism, they have been contending. It is a contention between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle believed in nominalism. Plato believed in idealism, rationalism. Now, the next part of economic thought is the Scholastics. And the Scholastics were church fathers. So we find that in terms of their theology is Christian. And in terms of their philosophy, they relied on the philosophy of the church fathers. And St. Thomas Aquinas relied also on the philosophy of the church fathers. And indeed, the scholastic work is a synthesis of Christian theology, and either Plato's metaphysics, epistemology, or ethics, or Aristotelian metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Much later in the 11th century, Peter Abelard introduced the notion of conceptualism as a midpoint between the idealism of Plato and the nominalism of Aristotle. So it's like sort of suggesting that yes, universal exists, but they don't exist in reality as Plato held, but that they exist in the mind of human beings. So that sort of comes to middle ground because Abelard was taught by both idealists and also nominalists. So it sort of found a middle ground between them. And of course, conceptualization then becomes an integral part of economic thought today, and important part of the academic intellectual work today. Now, when we move away from that era and we come to the pre-classical era, that era was dominated by atheism. David Hume, Bernard Mandeville, very important mercantilists, stroke classicals, they were atheists. And then the others, like Adam Smith, were also non-Christian. Their theology was non-Christian. So we have a theology of egoistical and unchanging man from the mercantilists, adopted by the classicals. And we also have their theology of the love of money, promoted by the mercantilists. Because as far as they are concerned, wealth is the principal thing. As far as classicals were concerned, wealth was also the principal thing. And it was under new classical work that they then moved from wealth to welfare. And then before later, Lord Robbins moved it from welfare to the relationship, a technical relationship between wants and ends. And in terms of their methodology, the methodology was still the dominant empiricism or nominalism and rationalism and idealism. And the classicals in particular were also to a large extent non-atheists in terms of their theology. And they also adopted the pre-classical theology of egoistical and unchanging man, and the theology of scarcity, and the theology of free enterprise, and the theology of love of wealth. And in terms of their philosophy, Adam Smith started as a moral philosopher and then became eclectic, a mix of rationalism and a mix of liberalism. So that in terms of methodology, it was eclectic and it was also abstract. Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, and John Stuart Mill were eclectic because in the Wealth of Nations, you see history, you see logical deduction, and you see a bit of empiricism also. So it was a mix. The same is true of Malthus, the same is true of John Stuart Mill. But David Ricardo was abstract speculative, purely logical deductive. And that is why, in terms of the father of logical deduction economics, it is David Ricardo that is often mentioned. So we see between the classicals and the new classicals, there's at the theological side, there's a disconnect from the mercantilists, from the pre-classicals, from the scholastics to the mercantilists, there's a disconnect in theology. But from the mercantilists to date, the theology is incremental. It is building on mercantilist theology. But in terms of the philosophy has also been changing because the classicals did not build on the pleasure pain that Jeremy Bentham postulated. That was well developed under Jevons, under the new classicals. Because if you look at the theory of pleasure and pain, the theory of utility, the theory of exchange, they are all built on Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian theology and philosophy. And then, of course, the methodology, the introduction of pure mathematics, then came into economics through Jevons and Walras. And Marshall did use mathematics, but he used it in a way that allowed him to be able to arrive at major claims, and then was able to discard the claims, the mathematics in the claims, and then use simple English to present the claims. So he advocated a use of mathematics that is not intrusive. You have mathematical ability, yes, use it to derive the implications of your premises. But after deriving the implications, interpret it in simple language so that others can follow. That is the Marshallian way of looking at using mathematics. Then as far as Keynes was concerned, of course, Keynes was an atheist and was interested more in the theology of peace, the theology of full employment, the theology of euthanasia of the rentier capitalist, and the theology of a caring or benevolent government. And that is why he wanted to shift all responsibilities for all the good works in society to government, because he was not convinced that the private individuals, with their greed, can actually deliver on the public good. And the history of the Great Depression convinced him, and the history of the negotiations at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference convinced him when he wrote the economic consequences of peace in 1919 that human nature could not be relied on to deliver a social optimum. The problem is, if at the individual level there's a character flaw, what is the guarantee that that character flaw will not translate to the social level? That is one area that Keynes did not consider, probably did not consider or at least did not leave some note, some writing for us to read and to understand how his mind thought. Then he also, because he was a student of Alfred Marshall, he sort of adopted Marshallian mathematical approach and also the logical deduction and also empiricism. So to a large extent, things was also eclectic. But post-Keynesian economics emphasized the utilitarian and liberalism. And so radical imperialism became the methodology, and ultra-empiricism became the contention. And then some also have a mixed methodology. And then more lately, we are talking about experimental, institutional, as well, and also historical. So this is the changing foundations of economics. It has not been static. The philosophies have been changing. The philosophies, the theology has been changing. But from the modern era, beginning from the 16th century, the theology has been incremental and has been further and further away from the Christian theology of the Scholastics. So that is as far as theology is concerned. But philosophy is also been consolidating around the utilitarian ethics and the epistemological debate between nominalism, empiricism, and conceptualism. And contemporary economic methodology is actually built on radical apriorism, ultra-empiricism, eclectic approaches, experimental approaches, institutional approaches, and also historical approaches. So I'm quickly going to go to the last area I want to discuss, which is reflections. Now, having said all I've said so far, in terms of the background that led to my thought or my conclusion then in the inaugural that economics needed a new foundation, I have provided the reasoning behind it and the suggestions that I made. Beyond that point, I had spent time to study Western philosophy, and also I've also gone for theological training, and I've also studied in more depth the classical work that are the foundations of economics. And I've shared with you some of my understanding from what I have gathered in the last 3 years since I left the ABU. And now I've provided how the foundations have been shifting, so that it was not what I thought was we needed a new foundation and we can restore economics. The moment you change the foundation, you are having a completely new economy. You can't have a foundation, a new foundation, and then you have new classical economics or contemporary economics built on it. It's not possible. It will be like an old wine in a new wine bottle, and we know that that will not work. So it is important to understand the evolution of economic thought, especially in terms of the underlying theology, the underlying philosophy, and the underlying methodology. So that what we believe now in terms of the foundations of economics and how to practice economics, and the purpose of economics, the structure of economics, and all the commitments of economics, we need to be sure in our mind before we start to use them that they are the right ones. Because if they are not the right ones, whatever, no matter how well we use them, they will not produce the right results. And if they don't produce the right results, there is danger for the world, because economic ideas are very powerful and they are very dangerous. If you promote competition, then you are going to promote asymmetry, because there are asymmetries in power relations. And therefore, in asymmetries of power relations, you are also going to produce moral hazard. That's why we're seeing in the financial sector that some banks are too big to fail. And therefore, the resources of the tax funds have to be pumped into them to sustain them. And then when you sustain them, they grow more powerful. And as they grow more powerful, they become, again, even bigger to fail. So you promote that, and you promote inequities in society. So as economists, we need to reflect on the power and dangers of economic ideas. And that should then caution us to be careful about the ideas that we are promoting, advocating, and to recognize that we have social responsibilities as economists. We cannot say, well, our job is just to teach, and our job is just to research, and that's the end of it. No, you are part of the system, you are part of the society. Your ideas change what goes on in society. So there's no way you can absolve yourself of responsibility. It's like a doctor who performs an operation and the patient dies and says, well, I just went there and performed my operation, and that's it. And the family of the deceased was that, but he was negligent. You should have done this, you have done that, you have done that. I say, well, I did my best. You can't do that. Because in fact, economics is more dangerous than physicians. Because physicians are not able to destroy as many people as a bad economic idea is capable of. So economics must always bear that social responsibility. And we must also remember, everybody has a choice. You either stand on the side of what is right, or you stand on the side of what is wrong. Yes, it is easier for us to flow with the tide and get the research grants, get the papers out published, and get our career enhancement. But there is an opportunity cost for that. So we must be conscious of the opportunity cost of every choice that we make. Because every choice that we make at individual level, at collective level, has consequences. So I'm going to stop at this point, and then I can entertain questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Garba. I'm sure that is really a fantastic presentation with so much details that I don't even know from where to start summarizing. You took us on a journey from history of economic thought to theology to philosophy, methodology, and even to contemporary times, and how we need a dynamic economics that is embedded in ethics, that is embedded in social justice and equity for everyone. I think these are the ideas we need, especially given the extent of inequality we are seeing, unprecedented inequality, where we have, if I'm not mistaken, what was it in the US about, is it 1% or less than 10% having more wealth than the 90%? Or maybe having about 8 people having more wealth than the half of the world's population. This is crazy. And also our economics that cannot predict major shocks like the financial crisis, or even fully understand the economic consequences of the pandemic and what policies we can implement to tackle what we're seeing now. Some economists are even arguing that government should start austerity before we're out of pandemic. You know, this is just crazy. Yeah, so thank you very much. We're slightly running out of time, and we have over 16 questions in the chat, so I'll try to run through them. Maybe we may not be able to tackle all questions, but I'll try to just go through them. So Abel asked, Prof. Garba, thank you for your elaboration. So are you proposing modifications to existing capitalist system or an alternative system based on these theonomic principles? If so, what form will this take? I think he asked the question earlier and you may have answered some part of it, but if you can add more information.
Should I answer that?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, it's definitely not. That's what Keynes tried to do, to rehabilitate the capitalist system, at least to inject it with a dose of equity. Unfortunately, because of our limits as humans, he didn't understand that the forces that he was contending against were more powerful than him. And I would encourage economic students to go and read what happened to him, how he died, how he engaged American extreme capitalists, and how after he left that meeting, he had a heart attack, and how he died when he got back to Britain. So these are serious issues. So it's not a question of rehabilitating capitalism, no. Because rehabilitating capitalism is okay, let us inject some virtues in it. You know, it's not possible. You have to have a new system. And the new system has to be based on new ethics. And instead of competition, for instance, the emphasis which Marshall pointed out is on cooperation. Because as humanity, we are interconnected. Even this webinar that we're having now is the product of cooperation. If there's no cooperation, each one of us is thinking about his own interest. We will not have this meeting together. So we know that when human beings come together, just like Biden was saying, that when Americans come together, they do great things. It's not only Americans. When human beings pull their talents together for the common good, they accomplish a lot more. Even game theory will show that non-cooperative games have lower sum of payoffs than cooperative games. So we know it. So it's not a question of rehabilitating, no. It's a new ethical system, a new economy.
That is great. Thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
we have Patricia asking, how do we ensure that economics as a discipline will accommodate continuous intellectual inquiry?
Well, first of all, it's important for us as students of economics, because we're all students of economics, to understand economics deeply. Because the danger what we have today is the mechanization of economics. All these technicalities of econometrics. Econometrics was something I did at on the graduate level, and God blessed me with the grace to be good at it, and also mathematical economics. But I do know that econometrics sits on very dangerous foundations also. Because in fact, I didn't do my PhD early enough because I was contemplating that I didn't want to use econometrics at all. Because econometrics was right with cons. And that's why I say if you do, when my students that work with me in Zaria, when you do an econometric work, you must come with your laptop. I want to see your data. I want to see you run the regression to make sure that the results that you are reporting are exactly the results that you got. Because there's a huge paper on the con in econometrics. So we should start at the theological level, at the philosophical level, at the methodological level. But you see, these things are not attractive today. Because the papers, those who win Nobel laureates, if you look at the list of Nobel laureates, they don't award Nobel laureate prizes to those who do philosophical work, those who do theological work, and those who do methodological work. It's those who do theory, pure theory. That's majority of Nobel laureates are pure theory. So the incentive system skews you in that direction. That's why you have to make a choice. Do you exist for Nobel? You can. Who remembers the Nobel laureates 2 years, 3 years ago? Who remembers them? It's just vanity. But contributing to society is more important and leaving a powerful legacy of impacting positively on society. So we all have to make that personal decision. And then that will then guide the intellectual way and the kind of intellectual careers we develop. I consciously make it, God helped me to make a decision that I'm not going to partake with all these grants that employ my services as a mercenary against Nigeria to help them to put together policies that injurious the health of Nigeria, either to borrow more in one area or the other. I deliberately, from the beginning of my career, decided that that was not the way for me. Yes, there are consequences, but you should be proud, you should be comfortable that the choice you make gives you peace and inner joy, that you have not contributed to making the conditions worse.
Okay, great. We have Buhari here asking, with what you presented, doesn't theonomics go more political economy than economics itself?
No, it's beyond political economy. It's more of, because the foundation is theology, actually. If you're looking at, you have theology, you have methodology, you have philosophy. So the foundation is theology. That's the bottom line. There's no way of sugarcoating it. It's theology. The things come from theology. The doctrines come from theology. The principles come from theology. And then in the theorizing, we apply the principles in the areas of exchange, in the areas of production, in the areas of consumption, in the areas of distribution. And so that rather than competition, we will begin to see that it is favoring more of collaboration, collaborative existence based on the interconnectedness of humanity. I, for one, do not believe that some people are black, some people are brown, some people are all kinds of senseless boxes that human beings have created. The essential nature of humanity is one. There's only one human race. It is those deceptive people who, for their interest, try to box people into social, economic, and political spaces for the purpose of control. That's the whole essence. And if you don't liberate your mind from that kind of stupidity, then you continue to play into the hands of those who seek to control the world and to help them, either knowingly or unknowingly, to continue in their journey. But unfortunately, it is not good for humanity.
Okay, that is correct. Maybe I would just add little. So, which theology you're taking up? Is it only Christian theology, or is your own theonomics also?
Please say that again.
Theologies. Maybe it's just me trying to ask. Okay. So let's just hold on a bit.
Sorry, I just want to check something. Sorry, go on.
Okay. So is your own theonomics also amenable to other theologies like Islamic theology or, I don't know, Buddhism?
There's already Islamic economics. You know the underlying principle of Islamic economics is from the Quran, is it not?
Yes.
What the principles come from there? That's the principle. So the economic, we know the economic principles, where they are coming from. They are coming from philosophy and they are coming from ethics. That's where economic principles are coming from. So instead of depending on philosophy and both ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics, their ethics, their philosophy rather, schools of philosophy or aspects of philosophy, we simply say, let's go to theology. And let us then see those basic principles of virtue. Because the ethics in philosophy, you hardly find a consensus. What you find that economists have adopted is Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, consequentialism. And they adopt that. And when you go to the book from which Jevons picked a whole principle, then use it to construct macroeconomic thought, you find that it's an atheist philosophy. So whether you like it or not, there's pagan theology in economics. There's atheist theology in economics. So it's either you say, we don't want theology, but you're actually promoting pagan theology and atheist theology or agnostic theology. That's what you're doing. And that's why in the last 3 years, one of the most powerful lessons I learned is that theology is part of the heritage of economics. And it's at the foundation of economics. No matter how people try to sugarcoat it or camouflage it, it's there. And we have to understand it and then ask, is that the right theology for economics? And if not, we change it. And then we have something completely different.
Okay, that is great. Here we have Lucrecy. It's a French term, so I don't know how to say it, but just asking, are the new foundations you proposed in line with evolutionary economics with concepts like path dependency or with Veblen's works?
Well, I know about evolutionary economics, but it's not exactly that. It's different. The only area of similarities with it is to recognize the dynamism of the environment. That the understanding has to be has to evolve. Yes, the understanding has to evolve. In other words, your understanding of the 20th century, you cannot bring that understanding to the 21st century. Indeed, your understanding of economics last year, where there was no pandemic, cannot be the same as your understanding of economics this year, because there's a pandemic, and the pandemic changes consumption, changes supply, changes fiscal operations, changes monetary policy. So we then have to understand the nexus between the environment, between the phenomena as it's evolving, and then be able to reflect it into our thought process. So the whole idea of mechanics and statics, it has to be discarded. And unfortunately, that idea is so powerful, ingrained in economics, that it's difficult to do economics without equilibrium theory. Even though we know when we look at the charts on financial data, all we see are oscillations, continuous movement.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So Sani is asking, you mentioned that economics contains theology, philosophy, and methodology.
Yeah.
Right. Please, can you justify one goal of economics for us to testify in brief?
A goal of economics?
Yes.
Well, that's part of methodological investigation of economics. What goal? Some will argue that the goal of economics is to explain observed phenomena. That's what some will say. Then some will go to the policy, that the goal of economics is not only to observe phenomena, to explain it, but to predict and also to provide, based on explanation and prediction, a foundation for policy. That's then why you have economic theory and economic policy go hand in hand.
Okay.
And actually almost every major economist never stops at just economic theory. He wants to be able to provide advice for policy.
So this one is an anonymous attendee saying, it is thrilling listening to Prof. Garba. However, I'm curious as to why he chooses that one of the foundations of economics should be Western philosophy. Why won't every economy adopt its self-styled ethics and local philosophy?
Please, let me hear that again, the last part.
Why won't every economy adopt its self-styled ethics and local philosophy? And rather than, he's saying that maybe you seem to promote Western philosophy. So why wouldn't,
no.
Okay.
No, that's not it. You see, Western philosophy and Western methodology is built into economics. There's no debate about that. Now, moving away, we found a foundation that unifies humanity. The idea of virtues, kindness. Can you localize kindness? Caring for people is not something you localize. Cooperation is not something you localize. These are general attributes of humanity. If you are traveling now in Nigeria and your car has a problem, there's a great likelihood that people who you don't know will come either to help you. And you can go in different parts of the world. That desire, even Adam Smith recognized that in his theory of moral sentiment, that human nature is empathetic towards others, even without expecting a transactional relationship. Just the intrinsic value of helping others. So it is those intrinsic, innate qualities that we are using as a foundation for theonomics. Because if you then say, okay, let us have theonomics for Nigeria, let us have theonomics for UK, it will not work. Because the central thing is the interconnectedness of humanity. We are one people. And if we are one people, your interest is my interest. My interest is your interest. Why? Your interest and my interest are interconnected. So we must recognize that interconnectedness. And therefore, we cannot say, okay, we want theonomics for the developing world. It will not work. Because even when Accords discovered, when he published the issue of externality, before externality was looked at one-sided. I am playing my music, you are reading, and if my music is disturbing you, so I should stop my music. He said, no, if I stop my music, I'm not enjoying the music. It's only your interest. So let us come to a compromise. At this time you read, at this time I play my music. You are satisfied, I'm satisfied. Because we are interconnected. And it's important to recognize that. Rich people and poor people, they are interconnected. Because the only way rich people can be rich is by taking away from the poor. So you cannot have poverty, solution to poverty, while the rich people continue to be amassing wealth. It will not work. That is why the poverty strategies that they are using fails at the beginning from the dead on delivery, because it is one-sided. But you must recognize interconnectedness and reciprocity of humanity.
Okay, great. We have a few questions almost bordering the same thing. And it's around, I'll just take one of them, saying, won't theonomics give rise to more ideological conflicts, especially in context where there is religious belief differences and uprising hostilities?
No, I believe some of the virtues there are virtues that are similar. You agree? There are virtues that are similar. In fact, there's going to be less disagreement than what we have. If the foundation is virtues, and the virtues are similar, there's no way kindness, goodness, caring for others, not amassing wealth for the sake of wealth. These are the basic principles. So with those basic principles, cooperating together, working together, there's no law against being kind to somebody. There's no natural law against kindness in every part of society. There's no law about looking after the interests of others. There's no law against cooperation. There's none. So all these things that are virtues, if they are the foundation, then there's no way the relations of exchange, relations of consumption, relations of distribution, relations of all other human relations will be affected. So that's the central thing. The relational content of humanity arises from the innate nature of humanity, the essential nature of humanity. So that's the point. So I agree that, but already there are works even in Islamic economics. And if you build a system based on non-usury, It works because non-usury is also similar in Christianity. Yes, it's a basic principle that you don't profit from money. But the Western system is suggesting that the usual system that they have built in finance is actually Christian. It's not. And that's the point that we're trying to make very clearly, to distinguish between theologies and philosophies and methodologies that are geared towards promoting iniquity and those that are geared towards humanity. So that's some of the simplification of the differences.
Okay, that is great. Maybe let me take just 1-2 questions and we end it. Because,
Okay.
but there is someone here says, how can post-Kantians be radical a priorist and ultra empiricist? Are those opposing attitudes? But my understanding is that when you use post-Kantians, you don't mean the post-Kantian school, but the other schools that came after Keynes. But I'm not, I don't know.
Yes, that's the point. I mean, because if you read my blog's book, he has 2 books, 100 Economics Before Keynes and 100 Economics After, Great Economics After Keynes. So it's in that sense I'm using it also. Keynes is just like a dividing line, before Keynes and after Keynes. So all the post-Keynesian, of course, there are many schools. You know, there are the institutional schools, there are development economics, orthodox, and even within development economics, there are different schools. You have the historical school, the institutional school, the neo-classical school, the counter-revolution, then you have neo-Keynesian schools, and then you have post-Keynesians. Even within Keynes, there are several different shades of Keynesianism that is operational today. So I just use that to say, okay, everything after Keynes is post-Keynesian, because Keynes was recognized as a milestone in economics, only in that sense.
Maybe let's take the last question, and this is from Suleiman Saleh Umar. So he's saying, mine is not a question, but a request. This one is asking for the PDF copy, and yeah, I will ask the prof to send me so that I can share with you.
Yes. As soon as you finish, I'll send it to you. Then you can distribute to them.
Yes.
So please, I also want to see all the questions, the Q&A and the chat.
Okay.
So I want to see them also, so that it can help me to reflect.
So what are the quick steps to ensure putting these things into policy, especially in countries such as Nigeria?
Well, the big steps, what we are doing now is part of the big steps. Because the change has to come here in the mind. You know, because it is the mind that guides us to the kind of things that come, whether ideas are right or wrong. But usually when our minds are corrupted by certain ideas, we just follow along sheepishly without knowing that we are being led into a dangerous direction. So we need to rethink. But moving forward, we already started a course in theonomics in Bowen University. So we have foundational courses, Foundation 1 and Foundation 2. So we are doing that. Eventually what we are, the direction we're moving is to having a theonomics program. And what that will do is that it will bring out a crop of students that are, their foundation is virtues, not vices of economics. So wherever they go, that will reflect in the way they think and the way they interact and the way they act. So it's actually a transformation of the human mind. That's the first step. And so all of this effort is geared towards transforming the mind, because the mind is what then produces the decisions, and the decisions influence the actions, and the actions influence the consequences. So you can't change the consequences without transforming the mind. So that's what we want to do. And of course the heart, because that's where compassion is, that's where kindness is. And unfortunately, philosophers, in all their philosophizing, they only limit their philosophizing to the mind and the senses, and they leave out the heart. It's just business, because their heart is dead.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. We've already exceeded time. And
all right.
Thank you so much for giving us this lecture, and thank you everyone for attending. So exactly in the next less than about 10 minutes, we'll start the next session, which is titled Toward Economic Pluralism, Perspectives from the History of Economic Thought. I'm sure you've mentioned a lot of schools from Plato down to institutional economics and the new schools. I'm sure people who are not familiar will be lost. So please, if you can join us in the next session, which will start in 12 minutes, where we will talk at a more basic level about history of economic thought, different schools of thought, and how.
Okay, maybe if I'm not able to join you, what I'll do, I could send some materials.
Okay, yes.
I'll send some materials because I'm also teaching history of economic thought.
Yes. So we have Dr. Danielle Gizo from the University of Bristol. She's the one giving that lecture. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Please, my regards to all the participants. God bless you all.
Okay. Thank you, Prof.
You're welcome.
See you, everyone. See you at the next session.